What happens when an arrogant flight attendant, obsessed with power and status, tries to humiliate a quiet passenger on a luxury private jet, only to realize she has just made the biggest mistake of her life? You won't believe how this flight ends. The private jet parked on the brightly lit runway, ready to welcome the special guests. The setting sun dyed the sky orange and purple, creating a scene like in a movie. Sophisticated men in expensive suits and elegant ladies in evening gowns walked along the red carpet leading to the cabin. The air was filled with the scent of luxurious perfume, proud eyes and bright smiles highlighted their class. In that glamorous atmosphere, a man wearing an old coat, carrying a worn backpack, silently walked up the stairs without attracting attention. He looked very calm, each step seemed deliberate, and his face was calm as if the outside world did not affect him. His slightly messy hair and sparse beard made him look out of place among the other passengers, the sleek and powerful people of the upper class. Liam Carter, a name known across the world, walked down the spacious aisle, quietly taking in his surroundings. Cream-colored leather seats, minimalist chandeliers, and even a small bar on the side set the tone for an environment of pure refinement. The passengers were already seated, engaged in superficial conversations about billion-dollar deals, luxury cars and private resorts. Meanwhile, Vanessa Hughes, a flight attendant with an impeccable appearance, scanned the cabin with sharp, calculating eyes, like a hawk surveying its territory. Years of working on private flights had given her a unique skill. With just a glance, she could determine who was important and who wasn't worthy of first-class service. And when her gaze landed on Liam, her brows furrowed slightly. Something didn't add up. The worn-out coat, the old backpack slung over his shoulder, he didn't look like he belonged there. Suspicion crept into her mind. She leaned toward a colleague, lowering her voice but unable to hide her doubt. "Are you sure? Did they check the passenger list?" Her colleague looked at her in surprise. "Of course he's on the list." But Vanessa wasn't convinced. Maybe he was an assistant, a personal aide to one of the VIPs? She stole another glance at him, but just as she did, Liam slowly looked up, meeting her gaze. His dark eyes were calm, unreadable, and then, he simply smiled. A faint, almost imperceptible smile. Outside, the engines hummed to life. The aircraft door sealed shut, and the flight was ready for takeoff. Vanessa straightened her uniform, took a deep breath, and prepared to carry out her duties. She poured champagne for the businessmen seated in the front row, then continued down the aisle, offering impeccable service to the wealthiest guests. But when she passed Liam, she acted as if he didn't exist. Liam said nothing. He simply tilted his head slightly as if watching an interesting performance. And he knew, this flight was just getting started. Vanessa leaned toward her colleague, her voice hushed but filled with suspicion. "Are you sure they checked the passenger list?" Her colleague gave her a puzzled look. "Of course he's on the list." Still unconvinced, Vanessa cast another scrutinizing glance at Liam. She bit her lower lip, her mind racing. Maybe he was an assistant to one of the elite passengers, a personal aide to a wealthy tycoon? Liam, in turn, noticed the wary look in her eyes. His dark gaze met hers for a brief moment, and then he simply smiled, a faint, knowing smile. He said nothing. The engines purred softly as the aircraft door sealed shut, and the cabin prepared for takeoff. Vanessa adjusted her posture, pushing aside her unease, and resumed her usual duties. She moved through the aisle with precision, offering champagne to the business moguls seated in the front row, then catering to another group of eager investors. But when she reached Liam's row, she walked right past him, acting as if he were invisible. Liam didn't react. He merely tilted his head slightly, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. The jet accelerated down the runway, and within moments, it was airborne, leaving the glittering cityscape behind. As Vanessa made her way through the cabin, she stole another discreet glance at Liam. She still couldn't figure out why he was there, but something told her that this seemingly unremarkable passenger was about to change her life forever. Test of status. The plane glided smoothly through the sky as the passengers settled comfortably into their luxurious seats. The soft hum of the aircraft blended with the clinking of crystal glasses and hushed conversations about exclusive deals and extravagant purchases. Vanessa, ever the embodiment of professionalism, moved gracefully down the aisle with a bottle of champagne in hand, filling the glasses of those she deemed important. When she reached Liam's row, however, her gaze passed right over him. She didn't even offer him a drink. Liam remained calm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't surprised, nor was he offended. Instead, he simply folded his hands in his lap and waited. A few minutes later, as Vanessa passed by again, tending to other guests, Liam raised his hand slightly and spoke in a polite tone. "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water?" Vanessa paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him with a mix of impatience and disdain. Then, with a cold, detached professionalism, she replied, "Only priority passengers receive full service." A quiet tension filled the space around them. A few nearby passengers overheard the exchange and cast discreet glances in their direction. Liam, however, showed no sign of offense. Instead, he gave a small, knowing smile, as if this was something he had seen many times before. "I see," he murmured, then turned back to the window as if nothing had happened. A businessman seated nearby had been watching the interaction closely. There was something about Liam that seemed strangely familiar. He studied him, his brows furrowing as he tried to place where he had seen him before. Before he could say anything, Vanessa had already moved on, ready to extend her charm and service to those she truly deemed worthy. A deliberate mistake. The flight continued smoothly, but beneath the surface tension had begun to build. The other passengers laughed, sipped their drinks and indulged in their luxurious surroundings, but one thing stood out: the way Vanessa treated Liam. She didn't just ignore him. She made a point of ensuring he felt out of place. Seizing an opportunity, Vanessa decided to put him in his place once and for all. She stopped beside his seat and, with a professional yet subtly condescending tone, said, "Sir, this area is reserved for exclusive clients. There are available seats in the back of the cabin." Liam lifted his gaze to meet hers. His expression remained calm, but his eyes held an unreadable depth. "I'm fine here, thank you," he replied, his voice steady and composed. The lack of submission irritated Vanessa. She was used to passengers who followed her authority without question. For a moment she hesitated, but then she decided it wasn't worth arguing. She muttered something under her breath and moved on. The businessman who had been watching everything now observed with even greater curiosity. He noted Liam's calm demeanor, the way he handled the subtle humiliation without a hint of reaction. That intrigued him. A few minutes later, Vanessa returned, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle, her expression unreadable. But inside, her patience was running thin. As she passed by Liam's seat, he shifted slightly, his shoulder barely brushing the edge of the cart. It was an imperceptible motion, one that Vanessa saw as an opportunity. With a calculated flick of her wrist, she tipped one of the bottles on the cart, sending an entire glass of ice water spilling over Liam. The liquid soaked into his coat and shirt, the sudden chill spreading across the fabric. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Vanessa placed a hand over her mouth in false shock. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," she said, her voice laced with insincere apology. Yet, the subtle smirk at the corner of her lips betrayed her true satisfaction. All eyes were now on Liam. He looked down at his wet clothes, took a slow breath, and then lifted his gaze to Vanessa. He said nothing. But the way he stared at her, a firm, unwavering gaze, sent a chill down her spine. The turning point. Perhaps it was the weight of his silent stare, or maybe it was the realization that he refused to feel inferior. Whatever it was, something in Vanessa snapped. She crossed her arms and louder than necessary declared, "You're a fraud. You don't belong here." The murmurs in the cabin faded. Conversations halted. The businessman watching from nearby furrowed his brows even deeper. Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "People like you try to sneak into this world thinking you can blend in. But in the end you're always exposed." She tilted her head, inspecting him as if he were a faulty product. "Are you even American?" A suffocating silence filled the cabin. Liam remained still, his gaze locked onto hers. And then, something shifted in the atmosphere. The businessman observing him raised an eyebrow, sensing an impending revelation. For the first time, Vanessa felt a flicker of unease creeping up her spine. It wasn't anger in Liam's eyes. It wasn't humiliation. It was certainty. As if he already knew exactly how this was going to end. Liam looked down at his wet clothes once more, then raised his eyes back to Vanessa. Still he said nothing. But the weight of his silence was heavier than any words. The entire cabin held its breath, as if standing on the edge of something irreversible. Vanessa stood her ground, arms crossed, lips pressed tightly together. She expected him to retaliate, to argue, to explain himself. Instead he simply watched her. And that unnerved her more than anything else. "Are you just going to sit there?" she snapped, her voice sharp and taunting. "Don't you have anything to say?" Liam tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the situation from a different angle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of something undeniable. "It's funny," he said. "You look at me and see a fraud. But I look at you and see someone trying desperately to convince themselves they belong here. Vanessa's confident facade cracked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Liam continued, his voice smooth but piercing. I've met plenty of people like you. People who think wearing an expensive uniform, walking these aisles with perfect posture, and stepping on others will make them part of something bigger. But do you know what happens when the uniform comes off? When the door closes and the plane lands? He let the silence stretch before delivering his final blow. You're still just you. It was as if the ground beneath her had been ripped away. Vanessa felt heat rising to her face, anger tightening in her throat, not just because of Liam's audacity, but because deep down she knew his words had hit exactly where it hurt. Shut up, she snapped, and before she could think, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. Smack. The sharp sound echoed through the cabin like a blade cutting through the silence. The hushed laughter from moments before vanished, replaced by murmurs of shock. A few passengers' mouths fell open in disbelief. Liam's head tilted slightly from the impact, but he didn't react immediately. Slowly, he ran his tongue over the corner of his mouth, tasting the faint tang of blood from a small cut. Then, with a chilling calm, he turned his gaze back to Vanessa. This time there was no anger in his eyes. No surprise. Only certainty. As if everything had already been set in motion before it even happened. Vanessa, who had felt so in control just seconds ago, now felt her stomach twist. For the first time she had no idea what to do. In the front row, a businesswoman's eyes widened. Wait, this guy looks like... But before she could finish, another passenger had already pulled out their phone and started recording. The sound of the slap still hung in the air, like thunder refusing to fade. The surrounding passengers were frozen. Some held their breath, others simply stared, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Liam Carter remained seated, his face slightly turned from the impact. But his expression remained unchanged. He didn't lift a hand to his cheek. He didn't react with anger. Instead, he slowly turned his head back and looked directly at Vanessa. She, on the other hand, suddenly felt uneasy. Her breathing became shallow, her hands trembled slightly. For the first time she felt she had gone too far. And then another sound broke the silence. Beep. The cockpit door swung open. The captain stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin, immediately assessing the situation. The moment he saw Liam and the redness on his cheek, his expression darkened. His deep, authoritative voice shattered the silence. What the hell happened here? Vanessa swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. She crossed her arms, still clinging to a sense of power. A passenger who doesn't know his place, she said, her voice laced with arrogance. The captain's face hardened, his nostrils flaring. Do you even know who you're talking to? Vanessa scoffed, still defiant. Honestly, I don't care. If he's causing trouble on this flight, he should be removed. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The captain let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as if he had just heard the most ridiculous statement in the world. Then he turned to Liam and did something no one expected. He removed his captain's hat and gave a respectful nod. Vanessa frowned. Some passengers looked confused. Then the captain revealed the truth. This is Liam Carter. And he owns this airline. The cabin erupted into murmurs of shock. The judgment and doubt that had filled the air moments before were now replaced by pure disbelief and recognition. Vanessa froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her legs suddenly felt weak and her stomach dropped. On social media, this story was about to explode. Passengers pulled out their phones, some already recording. The businessman who had been watching from the beginning crossed his arms and smirked. Well, now this just got interesting. Liam, however, remained as composed as ever. He gave a small nod to the captain and spoke in a calm, measured tone. Thank you for stepping in. But I think it's already clear to everyone what happened here. Vanessa knew. The humiliation she had so desperately tried to impose on this mysterious passenger had now come crashing down on her instead. Her face went pale, her hands clammy, her heart pounding wildly. She tried to open her mouth to explain, to defend herself, but there was nothing left to say. Everywhere she looked, she found only judgment and disbelief. The captain cleared his throat and addressed her sternly. Do you have anything to say? Vanessa opened her mouth but hesitated. No excuse could erase what she had done. I didn't know, she stammered, but her voice was weak, barely audible. The captain raised an eyebrow. And if you had known, would you have treated him differently? Or just pretended better? The silence that followed was suffocating. She wanted to respond, to justify herself, but no argument could change the reality in front of her. What terrified her wasn't just the public humiliation. It was the brutal realization that her mask had fallen. The once indifferent stares of the passengers were now filled with scrutiny and disapproval. Their phones recorded every moment, every beat of nervous sweat rolling down her face. But what made her tremble the most was Liam. He hadn't spoken a word since the revelation. He didn't judge her. He didn't insult her. He didn't seek revenge. He simply watched her. And that was worse than any outburst. Then, without hurry, Liam reached for his phone, unlocked the screen and calmly typed something. Vanessa swallowed hard. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with panic. Liam didn't answer. He simply placed his phone back on the armrest and returned to looking out the window, as if everything that had happened no longer mattered. But to her it did. More than anything. The captain spoke again, this time with finality in his voice. "We will be making an unscheduled landing." Vanessa felt her world collapse. Her eyes widened. Her stomach dropped. "What? No, wait, please." Her voice cracked, desperation leaking through. But no one was listening anymore. Passengers turned back to their seats. Phones continued recording. And Liam Carter, the owner of the airline, simply gazed out at the sky, as if none of this had remotely surprised him. Vanessa's stomach twisted as she watched him. What is he doing? But before she could react, the captain repeated himself. "We will be making an unscheduled landing." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cabin. Reality hit her like a freight train. She was being removed from the flight. Her eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to step in to defend her. But there was no one. No passengers. No crew. Even the captain avoided her gaze. And Liam? He remained seated, calm, gazing out the window, as if this entire situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his journey. The agents took her by the arms, guiding her toward the exit. "Please, don't do this. I can explain," Vanessa pleaded, her voice breaking. But no one was interested in hearing her justifications. As they passed Liam, she made one last desperate attempt. She turned to him, her voice trembling. "Mr. Carter, I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't know who you were." For the first time, Liam turned away from the window and looked at her. The entire cabin held its breath. Then, in a calm but piercing tone, he said, "You didn't need to know who I am. You just needed to know how to treat people." The words struck like a hammer. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no defense came. Liam turned back to the window. To him, this chapter was already closed. The agents led her down the stairs of the plane. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her job, gone. Her reputation, destroyed. She turned back, searching for some way to undo it all. But the door had already closed. Inside, Liam Carter continued his journey, as if this had been nothing more than a brief moment of turbulence. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no defense came. Liam turned back to the window. To him, this chapter was already closed. The agents led her down the stairs of the plane. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her job, gone. Her reputation, destroyed. She turned back, searching for some way to undo it all. But the door had already closed. Inside, Liam Carter continued his journey, as if this had been nothing more than a brief moment of turbulence. But was this truly the end for Vanessa? Or just the beginning of her downfall? The world had already seen her humiliation. Social media was on fire. News outlets were picking up the story. And somewhere someone was watching, waiting, for what would come next. Stay tuned for part 2.